Hi there, this is Kevin with International Dentist Central, and I'm delighted to spend some time with you in this video to discuss a vital topic for any of you who have upcoming dental school interviews, and that is how to discuss a weakness in your application during your interview without putting your foot in your mouth. I think you all know what I mean when I say putting one's foot in one's mouth. We've all been there at some point in our life, right? Perhaps it was a previous interview that you've been through, or maybe it was an important presentation that you had to give either to maybe your fellow classmates or fellow colleagues. Either way, you said something that possibly made you look worse than if you hadn't said it, and you immediately just wish you hadn't said anything and just kept your mouth shut about the whole issue. Well, you know, the truth is that this happens all the time with candidates who are trying their best in their interview to address issues of concern regarding their candidacy. And what often happens is that the candidate will sometimes volunteer to talk about the issue, or when they're asked about it by the interviewer, they will feel this sense of maybe guilt or shame that they've had for a while that's just been sitting there and stewing, and then immediately when they're asked about it by the interviewer, there's this feeling of like, oh, this is my opportunity to discuss this and get it off my chest. And so instead of strategically discussing certain parts of the issue and not certain other parts, a lot of candidates will just tell it all. Maybe what happened, how unfair things were, or maybe you were mistreated, or something terrible happened to you, and you're going to go into a lot of details about that. And before you know it, ultimately, a lot of candidates will make a bigger mess out of the issue than if they just hadn't said anything and the issue never came up, right? So it's very important to be careful and aware of what is appropriate to talk about when trying to address such an issue and what's appropriate to leave out. There are certain details that you just don't need to discuss that can actually make things worse. So what kind of concerns am I talking about here? Let's get into a few examples. Like, for instance, perhaps you have a significant gap in your profile. Maybe it's 2 or 3 years because perhaps you got married and then you moved to another country like the US or Canada. Or maybe you don't even have a good reason why you took off time from work, you just have this big gap there. Maybe you have an issue with your GPA, maybe it was below 2.0 when it was translated to the North American standards. Or maybe you have a number of classes during your dental school that brought down your GPA, maybe they were Fs or Ds or equivalent of those, and they brought those into the high 2s or low 3s. And maybe you don't have any particularly practicing experience as a practicing dentist in your home country or an associate dentist after graduating from dental school. Or maybe you're a candidate that doesn't also have any paid dental assistant experience in the US or Canada. Perhaps you don't have any research assistant experience, or you haven't even done any voluntary observerships in your past. Or what if you're a candidate that for whatever reason had trouble passing your NBDE Part 1 or Part 2 on the first attempt, and maybe you had to do one of those tests a few times to get through them, or maybe both tests were affected. If any of the above sounds like something that is in your experience, that's why I'm making this video. Now, before we jump into specific strategies for how to respond to questions about weaknesses, let's first establish what our ultimate goal is with regard to our interview and such questions in particular. In short, your goal in the interview is to minimize any concerns that your interviewers might have about you as a candidate so that they feel comfortable recommending you to the overall program selection committee, which ultimately decides the fate of each seriously considered candidate. Remember, it's not just the interviewer you need to impress. You need to impress a whole host of other folks who make up that selection committee. And what that means is, while you do need to address the concerns that the interviewer is bringing up, you actually need to spend your energy neutralizing that concern and then shifting their attention to more positive aspects of you as a candidate, which you believe outweigh those concerns. Now, there is a tactic in politics that's called pivoting. And that's effectively what we're trying to do here. The tactic is to give enough attention to the issue that's been raised in order to satisfy the listener, but then immediately switch or pivot the topic to something else that we want to have them remember. Basically, we want to leave them with an impression after that question that's positive and leave them with an emotion that's also positive. The tactic is not easy to accomplish. It's a delicate balance of making sure that they feel like you've fully addressed their issue that they brought up, but also not leaving it there. We don't want to just leave them in that space where, yeah, that was a bad decision, that was a mistake, sorry, and just leave the response in that place. It's kind of a downer emotionally, right? So want to do our best to deal with it and then move on so that we think about a more positive feeling. So let's look at how one could do this with a few of the examples that I mentioned earlier. Again, if you're someone with a 2 to 3 year gap in your profile with no particularly good explanation as to why, again, perhaps you got married and you'd moved to the US and maybe you just didn't really feel like getting started with jumping back into work. Now, how would you respond to a question as to why there's a large gap in your CV with regard to your work experience? Well, the first step would be to come up with some reasonable and believable explanation as to why you did not or could not work. Now, while I'd love to be able to just tell you exactly what to say here, just use these words, unfortunately, this needs to be different for everyone. Maybe you've heard the expression, the dog ate my homework, something that a student might say to a teacher. Well, I'm sure that after 2 or 3 times of that teacher hearing that excuse no longer worked, and suddenly that became a big joke that we all now tell, right? It's the same thing with candidates and the kind of information that we provide here in these videos. If I were to tell you exactly what to say, and then a lot of candidates were to take those words and try to use them in their interview, guess what? How effective would those excuses or justifications be for the same, maybe everyone has a similar problem who's using that? Wouldn't be that effective after all. They would catch on quickly, they'd mentally roll their eyes, and would give you no points for that question. So the justification that you decide to talk about needs to come from a place of authenticity. It needs to be true for you to a certain extent. Now, it doesn't have to be absolutely true. I'm not here to say that there aren't times where you need to kind of like make the background a little fuzzy in terms of your history, but you ultimately should try to find the closest reason to why you weren't able to work that you can find, and do what you can to make it compelling and make it sound as compelling as possible. It doesn't really matter what it is to me. Maybe you had a family issue at that time which required you to travel back and forth between here and your home country a lot. Or maybe you were volunteering at a nonprofit in another country, or you were on some sort of volunteer international mission trip, which again prevented you from being able to commit to a consistent work schedule in your local area. Whatever, maybe you had an Etsy store that you were helping your spouse, or an e-commerce store that you were helping your spouse run, and it took a lot of your energy and time, and ultimately maybe while it didn't succeed, it sure taught you a lot about how to run a business and accounting and things that would be useful someday, when you start your practice. These are just, again, some random ideas. There's plenty of other excuses out there, and you gotta find the one that's most closely related to you and that makes the most sense. Now, once you've provided your excuse, your reasons for why you can work, you now need to subtly bring up that despite not being able to work during that time, these are the things that I've done to make up for that lost time since then. I would go into all the various activities and actions that I've taken above and beyond most other candidates that can help to restore that lost time. Maybe I couldn't work 2 years ago, but this past year, these are the things that I've done, and hopefully those things again help to make up for the years or the year or two past. So what you're trying to do is again allay their fears and show that you're a person of action that is doing all they can to make the most out of the time that you've been given to prepare for this. And all the meanwhile, you're trying to ensure that they see that all these valuable experiences that you've done since that time have contributed to your knowledge, to your understanding of US dentistry, or something related to that effect. Maybe you've taken, maybe in the past year after that gap, you did a master's in biology or biotech, and that has contributed to a vast amount of knowledge and research understanding and all that kind of stuff. So again, we're addressing the issue that was brought up to us with the gap, giving them the reason, and then again pivoting to here's all the stuff I've done after that, which helps to make up for that and outweighs, it's like the balance outweighs some of that stuff that I may not have been able to do during that 2 or 3 year gap. Now let's say that it's, again, not being able to pass part 1 or part 2 on the first attempt. You're going to need to do the similar thing. Discuss the unique circumstances that prevented you from being able to give your full attention to the preparation of that exam. And then once you've, again, addressed that issue, you want to pivot to the exams you've taken since that exam, which can help demonstrate your superior study skills and mastery of that material. Perhaps you failed part 1 and beat part 1 in the first attempt, but after passing on the third attempt, when you started to prepare for part 2, you quit your job, you quit all the volunteer activities, and then you spent the next 3 months studying 7 days a week, 10 hours a day, and by the time you got to the test, there was no doubt in your mind that you were as prepared as ever to pass this exam, which you proved by indeed passing it on the first time. Again, this latter part of the response, where we're explaining what we've learned from the negative experience and how we were able to change the next time around to ensure it didn't happen again, this is extremely important, and it makes sure that we can help to allay the fears of the interviewer that we're not going to repeat this mistake again. This is over, we're a new person, we're changed, we've learned our lesson, and this is how we come and present ourselves to you. We don't want to present ourselves as somebody who never learned the lesson and just, oh, please forgive me. We want to show them that you don't need to forgive me. I've already overcome this issue. Now, some people will come to me and say, yeah, but I failed part 2 a number of times. What can I do now? I'm in a situation where, there are no other required tests that I need to take for this. That's a tough situation, so I'm not going to say it's an easy thing to deal with. There are some options for those who may need it. Now, if that was your only blip and weakness in your candidacy, if everything else was great, GPA, part 1, TOEFL is high, all that stuff, if everything else is great and the only thing you did was have to take part 2 twice, I think it's forgivable. But if you're a candidate that had issues in part 1 and you also had other GPA issues and poor grades and stuff like that, and you are trying to establish some way of discussing and showing that this is not who you are anymore, you're going to need to actually do that. You're actually going to need to take some additional tests, even if they're not required probably, to showcase that this is a new me. That was the old me, this is the new me. There are some candidates I talk to take the DAT optionally. Some take some other exams that are medical or dental related, just to showcase they have the capacity to study and succeed on a test. And hopefully that's not the case for you. Hopefully you're not in that position, but for those of you that are, you might consider some different tactics like that. Now there's one last thing I want to talk about. There are some things in our past which we simply cannot explain away with any simplicity. They're obvious big mistakes, and there are no real easy ways to just cover those up or justify how or why they happened. We just made a simple mistake, maybe it was a big mistake, and no amount of explaining or excuses is really going to take away from that. So whereas there are some cases where you can use an external circumstance, again, maybe traveling because of family or personal reasons, maybe finance issues, maybe issues of moving and immigration and stuff like that are out of your control that may have affected your ability to work or your ability to prepare or study. There may be, in those cases, a good reason to try to make an excuse for those. There are other types of situations where you flat out it was your bad, it was your mistake. And no amount of explaining it's not gonna work, right? Now the thing is that ultimately you have to decide if the issue that you're dealing with in your profile is one of those obvious mistakes that was completely your fault, and you shouldn't even bother trying to make an excuse for that, or is it something that you can possibly provide a justification for. If it is something that you just have to admit and there's no real good way to explain it away, there's not much more you can do except just admit the error and discuss what you have learned from that incident, from the situation, that will hopefully never let that happen again. And again, provide some proof and evidence of what you've done to ensure that it doesn't happen again, and some examples about that, as well as, again, pivoting them a little bit more away from the negative and to some other things that you have done that are very good, that are very strong, especially compared to what most other candidates have under their belt. So again, it's not always about trying to, your excuses are only going to go so far, they're only going to work so effectively. The goal, again, is to address them and then move on. So hopefully that helps give you a better template to follow for how you can craft a strategic response to difficult questions regarding the weakness of your profile. For those of you who have an upcoming interview, I hope you will take these ideas, these concepts, and do your best to come up with a great response. I would recommend writing out your response bullet by bullet. I don't recommend writing the complete sentence form of it, but just bullets of what you plan to say, an outline, let's say. And then I would practice that before your upcoming interview. For those of you who don't have an upcoming interview right now, but plan to apply in the next year or two, maybe because you're finishing up a program such as a master's or something, I hope that you'll understand through this video how important it is to try to have as clean a profile as you can when you're submitting your application. It's very competitive out there, and you want to make sure that if you are going to be taking any tests like part 1 or part 2, you give it 100% of your energy. It's really difficult to be in this situation where you have to try to find excuses, and it's just not fun if you can avoid it. I mean, if you have to do it, no problem, you'll find a way. But my hope for those of you who aren't even there yet in your candidacy is to make sure that everything you do, remember, each thing is a piece of a larger pie, and that pie is what they evaluate at the end. But if you have a piece of a pie that has some significant problems with it, it can take away from your likelihood of getting accepted. So again, if you're early on in this process, make sure to give every aspect your all, including your preparation for your interview, for your bench test, including ensuring that all your application documents are pristine and perfect and impressive, and making sure that all your tests that you've taken are either passed or in a good rank. So these are all the aspects, of course. I hope this video, again, has been valuable to everyone listening. If you have any questions about anything I've mentioned in this video, please leave it in one of the comment boxes below, and we'll do our best to respond to you as quickly as we can with our thoughts and feedback about your question. As you may see, we have an interesting offer that we're providing this fall, and I hope you'll check that out by clicking on the button below this video. If you're on our website, or in the description below, there's a link so you can learn about a very special package that we're offering regarding bench test and interview mastery, as well as some other goodies that I think you guys will find valuable. So click on that if you haven't, and until next time, until the next video, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you.